people of color, people with disabilities who need to use the transit system differently than people who have a car? What are so some specific strategies? How do we ensure that we are using strategies to engage people and get good opinions?
Read my books. No, I think that there's no cookie cutter. There's no cookie cutter, but I do think there are some basic ingredients for expanding the kinds of information dissemination and participation. And the first rule, you have to go where people are. And you have to use the institutions that they deem important information disseminators. You have to also use the indigenous leaders, incumbent leaders, as messengers, as carriers of the information, as opposed to having people parachute in. You need to have some incumbent leaders, you know, who become experts in these areas, and so that means you have to start recruiting some people, and you have to also start expanding the kinds of contracting and resources that are placed in non-traditional sectors, such as some of the church-based organizations, and some of the faith-based organizations, and some of the voluntary associations, neighborhood associations, civic clubs, and fraternal organizations, etc. And I think in some cases you have to use the ethnic media. You have to expand, and I know a lot of this is done, but I do think that that we have to diversify the way messages are disseminated and the messengers themselves, because having someone come into a community and just delivering it message and information can be very different than a community leader who is part of that community and talking about opportunities and how our communities can benefit from participating. So the message is important, but messengers are also important.
Thanks. Monique?
I was going to totally concur with that, and I've found when we do a lot of community engagement work, you have to build those relationships and leverage. Consultants sometimes don't have those relationships, but they really have to respect those that do have those relationships and partner with those entities to get those messages out. And that's a lot of our world is driven by consultants and really trying to check those boxes of public engagement. And I, again, cannot stress enough what Dr. Bullock just said, that you have to be non-traditional and go where the people are. Can't stress that enough. And not to presume that technology is going to be accessible to these particular communities who make up now the majority of our population, that they have ready access to a computer. So you've got to figure out how can you reach those people, and where do you reach those people. And it's not going to always be, it may be on their bus schedule or at the transit center. And so, where are those folks and being where they are? We've got to get out into the community. I just can't stress that.
Thanks. Jay?
I just wanted to add, agreeing with what was just said, that there's exclusionary language of a couple types that we use a lot. And I guess before I say this, I would like to say that HGAC, along with Metro, along with City of Houston, has come a long way, and there are various processes that HGAC does, so we should study what's working now in these processes first. But there's exclusionary language, and there's a couple types. One is the technical, and so whenever there's an RFQ or RFP or a TTC thingy jobber, we need to be careful. And there was specifically at the beginning of the regional plan process, there was a thing to sign up to be on work groups or something. And the very first draft was so technical and like, well, if you want to be a citizen engaged, it was like 2 pages of what you're going to be signing up for. So that was exclusionary. That was somebody volunteering their time to be part of something is less likely to do it if they don't have time and if they're working 2 jobs and they ride transit all day. And so being too technical and too long is a type of exclusionary language. But then another one to challenge is, so on Jeff's survey, it was Jeff's job to do as best as he can to reach out to broad populations. But telling people that's what you're doing is exclusionary. You know, if you say, I'm trying to reach African American populations with a survey, so the other 83% of the people in the region, what are they supposed to think about that? It's not their job. It's not the citizens' job to sift themselves out. You know, as planners, you need to find ways to reach people, and not using exclusionary language all around. You know, and so I think in some ways the regional plan has changed, and that they've started sort of saying the people of the Houston region. And if they're being honest, and if they successfully are reaching broad people, I think people want to be addressed as people, as citizens, and not as some target population that you're supposed to check off. So,
Thanks. Yes.
There's another point. It's a small point, but if you look at the 5 largest cities in the country, Houston may be one of the only one of those 5 that really, and correct me if I'm mistaken, that doesn't have a transit riders union, a transit riders league, like the LA Bus Riders Union and the Transit Riders League in Atlanta and some of the other places. It's that organization, or that type of organization. We organize transit riders into a body and to a collective that will look at all these issues in terms of services and fare rates and where the investments are going and TODs and et cetera. Most of the data has shown that those groups in those cities where they operate, from New York, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, et cetera, they really enlighten the publics who are transit riders, stakeholders, collective, and oftentimes hold accountable those governmental agencies that provide transportation.
Thanks. That's a helpful point to think about, and I think it's important for us to emphasize that this is about transportation choices, and in Houston we want to make sure we have a lot of choices, and it's important that we ensure that there are funding opportunities to support choices. So the Rockefeller Foundation commissioned a study in 2011 that showed that 80% of Americans favored more investment in public transportation and public transit. And we saw some similar data that was shown here earlier today about the Houston region. Yet in some communities there are ballot initiatives. Atlanta's one. We saw something similar here in Houston, where the opportunity to provide more dollars toward that, not to the total exclusion of something else, but to offer more for public transportation, get turned down. What are some things that our elected officials can do? What are opportunities to think about to kind of build the constituency around supporting what essentially is more public dollars for public transportation? What are ways to build coalitions for support around this, and what are some opportunities that maybe we missed this time around with the vote that we had?
Well, let me just, I won't talk about Houston, but I'll talk about Atlanta. The reason why all those black folks didn't vote for MARTA, didn't vote for that transportation thing in Metro Atlanta, because it was not going to basically build out and support the most mature system, and it was going to be basically not providing resources for MARTA to expand it outward and allow the system to basically be the dominant mode. And I think people voted in terms of not against transit, but against a plan that was not going to provide the opportunities that they saw that they had been paying into a system for 40 years, and somehow it was going to be taken away and expanded in a way that would have differential negative impacts. So I think that it's important that when referendums come up, that we educate the public about the real deal and not some left field smoke screen, hidden, not transparent. It needs to be very transparent. It needs to be very clear. 2 + 2 = 4, and don't have new math. And so I think it's important that when people don't see it like that, they don't support it.
Real quickly, I would just add that one of the things that I've been talking about for a few years is capacity building of our elected officials, and then, you know, putting them where they can know that their constituencies actually do support these things, because I think they only hear it from the naysayers, and it doesn't take that many of them. Whereas most folks who really want this stuff and support these issues don't come in and don't voice their opinions. But really also building their capacity to know what other places are doing and and what all the options are can be empowering to them. And, you know, they can then further and help us build the capacity within the community. So that would be something else that I think we should work towards within the various entities and projects and grants that are now floating around. Now, you know, you guys know what they are.
Thanks. Did you want to add anything?
I think this will be short, just like on the Metro referendum, I think a lot of people, we didn't lose $2.1 billion worth of rail funding. We lost $2.1 billion worth of transit funding regionally. And so I think we've had this silly debate about technology between rail and bus, and then we've also we failed at having the press and the public talk about what we're talking about if we want transit funded. And instead it was this debate about the rail. And so the key there is that if we can have more people in the region see how these things will benefit them, and so more transit funding would have, if we had one, it would have meant more HOV bus, so suburban commuter, wealthy individuals would have had better transit funding. So these messages need to go out to how better spending can benefit you. And I think choosing tomorrow always tries to be the smartest, and maybe that's not, we try to win the argument, whereas we really need people to see how it helps them. So.
Thanks. Thanks to our panel for their comments. We appreciate what they've shared today.